Well, welcome everyone to the Colonial Society of Massachusetts and our 2026 Donald Friary Forum. The Colonial Society was founded in the 1890s to perpetuate the study of early American history, and the main thing we do is publish primary documents. So we publish over 100 volumes, and this summer we will be publishing for the first time ever the Papers of John Hancock. Volume 1 will be rolling off the press sometime in July. And not July 4th, unfortunately. And the Papers of Daniel Gookin. Do you have a date you want the Gookin papers to appear? Will be appearing later in the year, as well as other, and we've digitized all of our volumes. They're available online for free, but also in elegant hardcover editions. And if there are any particular of our publications you would like, see me afterward, and I'll show you to the basement, where we have many copies. And presidents of the Society, I am the president of the Society, do come and go. The editor of publications is actually the driving force, but presidents do play a somewhat important role in keeping things going. And for 14 years, we were really privileged to have Donald Friary as our president. And Donald Friary came to us after he thought he had retired from a career in public history, running historic Deerfield. A great scholar, encourager of scholars, and really put the Society on a good footing to continue the work it is doing, it has been doing, and doing it better. So we created these forums to honor Donald Friary as well as to perpetuate what the Colonial Society does. So it's evolved into a conversation about some topic in early American history. And this year, this particular panel was suggested by another member, Bob Hall, who unfortunately can't be with us, and he suggested a panel on African American material culture involving archaeologists. And we were fortunate that he identified the archaeologists we should contact, and they all agreed to come and be part of this conversation. And I will introduce them in the order they are seated here, which I believe is the order, I can't remember which is the order you'll be going, but you'll figure it out. So first it's Alexandra A. Chan, who is an archaeologist, artist, and author. After receiving her doctorate in historical archaeology at Boston University, she returned to her undergraduate alma mater as an assistant professor of anthropology. In fact, her undergraduate degree was a joint anthropology and German degree. And she spent 10 years as the principal investigator for Monadnock Archaeological Consulting in New Hampshire. And in addition, as I said, to being an archaeologist, she is an artist. She's an award-winning photographer, taking really stunning pictures of Portsmouth and other areas, and also is the proprietor of Rising Phoenix Arts. And her latest book is In the Garden Behind the Moon, a memoir of loss, myth, and magic, or an award-winning book about loss, myth, and magic, as well as using the tremendous artwork she has done. I should have brought pictures, so I can't describe them. And her first book was Slavery in the Age of Reason, Archaeology at a New England Farm, which I believe is the topic she'll be talking a bit about tonight. And she's also done an article on that for Cricket, the Cricket magazine for young readers, Dig into History, which was a special issue on the Atlantic slave trade. So Alexandra Chan was the lead archaeologist on the project we will be shortly hearing about once I stop pontificating. And Kabria Baumgartner is the Dean's Associate Professor of History and Africana Studies at Northeastern University, where she is Bob Hall's successor. Previously, she has taught at the University of New Hampshire as well as the College of Worcester. She received her doctorate at the University of Massachusetts. She also has a graduate certificate in British Studies from Humboldt University in Berlin, and she was an undergrad English major at UCLA and also received an MA in African American Studies at UCLA. And her first book was In Pursuit of Knowledge on Black Women and Educational Activism in Antebellum America. And sometime this year, I believe, her book On the Cusp, is it still this year? Next year, okay, good. On the Cusp, Black Youth and the Origins of Civil Rights in Boston will be appearing. She is the co-editor of the Black New England Studies, New England series from UMass Press. She's the co-founder of Newburyport's Black History Initiative, which aims to highlight Newburyport's Black history. and she also collaborated on a project, an NEHC grant-funded project in Lynn along the Saugus River, tracing the King Pompey homestead on the Saugus River. King Pompey was an enslaved African man who won his freedom, purchased property, and hosted Black Election Day celebrations in colonial Massachusetts. So, Kabria Baumgartner, welcome to the Society. And Kyera Singleton is the executive director of the Royall House and Slave Quarters in Medford. She's been there for 6 years. She's also a postdoctoral fellow for the Slavery, Colonialism, and Their Legacies Initiative at Tufts. She received her doctorate in American culture at the University of Michigan, writing about containing black women, plantations, cities, and the public life of slavery. Received her undergraduate degree at Macalester College. She's been an American Democracy Fellow at the Charles Warren Center, had fellowships at the Beinecke Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, and Emory University's James Weldon Johnson Institute for the Study of Race and Difference. Was the co-curator of the Boston Slavery exhibit at Faneuil Hall. She's a member of the Table of Voices cohort at the MFA for the Hear Me Now exhibit on the Black Potters of Old Edgefield, South Carolina. She's also on the Boston 250th and 400th Commission and a board member for Mass Humanities, and she's also on the advisory team for Just Flicks, a youth-focused storytelling organization in Medford. So really a dynamic panel. I know any one of them would be enough for one evening, so we're packing a lot into the next hour or so. So thank you all for coming.
Whoops. I'm tethered. Is my mic working? People can hear me. Excellent. Okay. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Bob. That's amazing. We agreed to try to keep our remarks to 7 or 8 minutes each so that there'd be room for lots of discussion and question and answer and everything. So without further ado, good evening. I'm Alexandra Chan. I am a historical archaeologist, and much of my work has focused on the excavations at the Royall House and Slave Quarters in Medford, which is home to the, if you don't know, the last freestanding slave quarters in the north. And when I was excavating there, this would have been back in 99, 2000, 2001, people passing by loved to lob questions over the fence. And one of their favorite questions was, "Hey, finding any gold?" And I would always answer in the same way, "Nope, something better." Because archaeologists do not dig for treasure, we dig for information. And at sites like this one, information is priceless. So over 3 field seasons, our team excavated the grounds of what would turn out to be one of the most significant surviving archaeological sites of northern slavery. Documentary evidence tells us that at least 65 women, men, and children were held at this estate over time, which makes it one of the largest slaveholding households in 18th century New England. Now, that fact alone often surprises people because many Americans still imagine slavery as an institution that belongs to the South, or at the very least that northern slavery was a different kind of animal, that it was less central to the economy perhaps, or was more gentle, or had more family-like relationships. Now, one of the most important things archaeology has helped us show is that this comforting distinction simply does not hold under scrutiny. What fascinated me most about this site was the contradiction between what the estate was designed to communicate and what the archaeology revealed about how it was actually lived. So the Royall estate is very, it was carefully staged. And let me see here. Oh, these are the royal family, if you can see that there. And then the silhouettes are a digital rendering of a pair of enslaved siblings that we know lived on the site. Their names were Joseph and Prime. And so we like to show them in conjunction with the family rather than just, act like they weren't, that they weren't there. The Royall estate was carefully staged. It's Georgian architecture, which is full of allusions to the ancient villas of Rome, the formal landscape design, and unusually substantial slave quarters, projected order, refinement, legitimacy. I like to joke that trying to associate themselves with ancient Greece and Rome is guilt by association. But this was no accident, because Isaac Royall was the son of, Isaac Royall Sr. was the son of a carpenter. He was upwardly mobile, and he had big aspirations, and he was crafting a material statement about who he was, how he wanted to be seen, namely as a cultivated gentleman, as more importantly, I would argue, as a benevolent patriarch. Now, this was a Puritan ideal in New England at that time. He was not a Puritan, but culturally it was very pervasive, and he wanted to be seen as a benevolent patriarch. And a man naturally entitled then to the power that he had amassed. Also, he wanted to be seen as someone who was wielding that power responsibly. Even the physical proximity of the slave quarters, which you can see there, to the main house, not to mention the architecturally complementary style, helped support this image of inclusion and incorporation and intimacy. It sanitized the face of slavery. It tried to present it as something civilized, and was in keeping with this idea that the enslaved were, according to Royall himself, my people. He only called them my people in his letters. He never called them slaves or even servants. So that gives you a little bit of a window into the mindset there. Now, the documentary archive tells us certain things. Whoop, there we go. The documentary archive tells us certain things about this estate. We have names, inventories, wills, there's census records, legal relationships. Shown here a little bigger so you can see are Joseph and Prine, the enslaved siblings. And a good reminder that in the 1750s there were 15 children on this site, and only 2 of them were white. Archaeology reveals how those relationships were materially organized, how they were experienced, contested, lived, and it allows us to test the Royals' performances against the material reality. And what we found told a very different story. Nearly 80% of the site's artifact assemblage came from the side and rear yards of the slave quarters. Broken ceramics, food remains, construction debris, work materials, and the archaeological traces of daily life and of daily labor and domestic life were found there. And what this means is that, in other words, and oh, it doesn't work on this, fine, whatever. If you have questions about what those images are representing, I'm happy to explain. The architecture projected harmony and inclusion. The lived use of space revealed a clear separation in the use of space. The darker areas are the highest count of artifacts. And 80% of 65,000 artifacts were found in those 2 areas. So the landscape above the ground was saying one thing, landscape below the ground was saying another. Architecture said family and inclusion, benevolent patriarch. Archaeology said hierarchy and power. So this is where material culture becomes so powerful as historical evidence. It lets us see how systems of domination were built, not just in the law and in ideology, but actually in the physical space of the lived environment, into sight lines. Now, if you look on the bottom picture there, you can see from that back corner of the slave quarters building, the one thing you can't see is the great house, right? And so if you can't see the great house, they can't see you. And they didn't. So that is how these separations and hierarchies were built into the physical landscape. It's built into sight lines. It's built into the movement through the estate. It's built into labor zones, boundaries between visibility and invisibility. At the same time, we've got the archaeological record that also preserves quieter evidence of resistance and self-definition. On the left, you will see material statements of legitimacy belonging to the Royals. On the right, you will see artifacts we associate with the enslaved, gaming pieces, sewing equipment, a stone or glass bead. And one small object I wanted to call attention to sort of set the tone for the rest of our conversation. There were so many to choose from, but I decided I'd choose this one. We recovered was a clay tobacco pipe incised repeatedly with the letter M, which may have belonged to Myra, who was an enslaved woman in 1754 in the Massachusetts slave census. Now, we can't know with certainty that it was hers, but I really like to think that it probably was. I checked the records. In 300 years of habitation, there is no other person that lived on this site with a name that started with the letter M. And so if it was indeed Myra's pipe, this little simple mark may represent something quite profound, an assertion of identity, of ownership, an intimation, or at least an aspiration toward literacy, all within a system that was built specifically to erase all of those things. So that's one of archaeology's great gifts. You know, it allows us to recover not only the structures of oppression, but traces of individuality and choice and creativity, presence, agency. This is like day-to-day kind of resistance. So for me, the Royall House demonstrates that the archaeology doesn't simply confirm what we already know from the documentary record, it complicates it. It challenges the inherited narratives that we've received from on down the line. And it helps us ask how power, race, and resistance were materially negotiated in everyday life amongst ordinary people in everyday life. So the Royall House also reminds us that sites of slavery are also sites of memory, because they're places where the material record preserves histories that traditional narratives often tried to smooth over, to soften, or to erase entirely. And archaeology gives us one way of listening carefully enough to hear them again. When I was back in my teaching days, I used to tell my students that artifacts are not inanimate objects. They speak to you if you know how to listen and if you're asking the right questions. So I'm looking forward to exploring these questions further with my fellow panelists today and to thinking together about what material culture can tell us about the landscapes New England, or the histories that New England landscapes still hold beneath the surface. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I echo Alexandra in thanking the Colonial Society for inviting me to participate in this symposium, and to all of you for joining us this evening. It's a nice, wonderful Boston evening, so thank you for spending it with us. It's also great to see some familiar faces here, and then some new faces. It's great, too, to be on this panel with Kyera and with Alexandra, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we'll have about material culture. And I wanted to talk specifically about a project I've been working on for the last 2 years, Slavery and Emancipation at St. Peter's San Pedro Church in Salem, Massachusetts. This is a community-engaged project, and I'm happy to say more about what that means maybe later. But we are interested in exploring the archives at St. Peter's San Pedro Church in hopes of confronting the history of slavery at the church and thinking about what responsibility we have today to atone for that history and to understand that history. So our aim is to surface the stories of enslaved people named in the parish records from its founding of the church in 1733 to 1833, which is when the building underwent renovation. I work on this project in collaboration with, as I said, church leaders, with community members, and with some very wonderful Northeastern graduate students whose names are there. So this is very much a team effort. The current rector of St. Peter's San Pedro Church is Reverend Nathan Ives, and he is committed to telling the truth about the church's entanglements with slavery. And he is interested in this in part because he learned about the story of Flora McGilchrist. She was a black woman enslaved by William McGilchrist in the mid-18th century. And Reverend Ives had some very specific questions for us as we were embarking upon this archival research. He wanted to know, where was Flora born? Who were her kin? At what age did she arrive at St. Peter's? And how long was she enslaved there? So these questions guided our archival research. As I said, it's very much a collaborative project with researchers and community partners working. So we've been doing this for about a year and a half. I should say that this is a collection that was reacquired from Phillips Library, and Dan was very helpful in working with Reverend Ives and getting those materials to the church. So these materials are now at the church. So we were there every week, pouring through 20 boxes, and I can share here that we have found no answers to these questions.
Oh, man.
And that's the nature, I think, of studying slavery, right? And studying the experiences of enslaved people, African and indigenous. But I think her story is fascinating to highlight anyway for this symposium, in part because I do think she complicates how we think about material culture. She complicates this conversation. So you might be wondering, if there's so little about Flora in the church's archive, how do we even know that Flora was at St. Peter's Church? And we know because of the will of William McGilchrist. So while McGilchrist's will doesn't allow us to examine the physical characteristics of specific objects that he named in the will, it does reveal how certain objects were classified, valued, and entangled with enslaved labor. So these objects survive only as archival traces. So what I'm offering here is an analysis of the material culture of slavery through documentary representation of objects. So a little bit different than Alexandra's exploration of the Royal House. William McGilchrist was born in Scotland in 1710. He briefly served as an assistant minister in South Carolina before becoming the second minister of St. Peter's Church in Salem in 1746. He held that position for more than 30 years until the church's closure during the Revolutionary War. He died in 1780. So what is pictured here is the first page of his will. And on this page, McGilchrist frees Flora. He says, "I hereby manumit or free my Negro servant named Flora." So he's legally manumitting Flora, and in doing so, he's confessing that he was an enslaver. The same document that recognizes her freedom records his prior ownership of her. And it also links that freedom to a series of material bequests. So this is the next section of McGilchrist's will. And I'll say that just reading the will, he devotes most of it to these objects that he names and to Flora. So I'm not going to read this entire list, but I will just summarize by saying he bequeaths to Flora all her wearing apparel, a bed and bedding, chairs, trunks, and other household goods, which you can read here. Taken together, these objects and the will itself orient us toward Flora's life at the moment of emancipation, right? At the moment of manumission. And we can also imagine maybe what would come after. These objects create the conditions for what I call embodied independence. Clothing, sleeping furniture and bedding, storage, cookware, tableware. These are the objects that McGilchrist thought Flora would need in order to live as a freed woman. They underscore that freedom was a material condition just as much as legal status. And the phrase, all her wearing apparel, is interesting here because it implies that there was some possessions that Flora already had and was understood as being hers. But in the ways that we think about slavery, of course, McGilchrist still had to clarify that he was the one legally giving this clothing to her. We might also consider what these objects reveal before manumission. The cookware, the tableware, and so on point backward to the domestic and church-related labor that structured Flora's daily life. So as an enslaved woman, she likely performed a range of tasks from cooking and serving to washing and ironing, tending fires, cleaning dishes, the list goes on. So these were objects that were work-related, but they also become objects of ownership. Their passage to Flora at the moment of manumission means that the tools that had organized her labor were then reclassified in the will as the equipment for her freedom. And this is the last part of McGilchrist's will that mentions Flora. He says, I gave to Dr. Edward A. Holyoke my cloak, and then I cannot read the word that comes after that. So if any of you have really good eyes with handwriting, maybe you can help me figure out what that word is. But he says cloak, and then I give Flora my red purse and the money in it. This purse with money in it is part of that same material infrastructure, if you will, of manumission. So unlike the bed and the chairs and the trunks, the purse is more portable, and there is money in it for Flora. Its redness may have helped identify something already known within the household. That red purse with that money inside for Flora. And perhaps red carried Christian liturgical significance or resonance, but I think its clearest function here is practical and legal. It transfers money to Flora. So for years, perhaps even decades, we don't know, Flora's labor sustained McGilchrist's life and his ministry. In churches across New England, enslaved people like Flora performed the work that made worship possible, cleaning buildings, cooking, and meeting daily demands. Their labor upheld the material conditions of religious life, even as they stood at its edges. So Flora enters the record at the point of McGilchrist's death. His will suggests something like atonement, but no purse filled with money and no household goods could restore the years of enslavement that she had lived. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to the Colonial Society for having us, and what an honor to be on the panel with both Alexandra and Kabria, both of whose work have influenced me as a scholar and have helped me think about how to approach doing the work of talking about slavery and talking about material culture in this period. So I'm going to start a little differently. I'm going to take us to 2020. In March of 2020, I had been living in the area for a few months at that point. My advisor had left Michigan and brought me with her, and I was trying to finish a dissertation. And the job came up for the Royall House, and I was very sad because I had just left Atlanta, and I got to the Boston area, and I was like, oh, I guess I only have to write. What else can I do here? Before that, I was working at the ACLU as a policy fellow, so I was actually really missing talking and working with communities. I had been working on the team for reproductive justice and then also voting rights. And so getting back into my dissertation didn't feel the most exciting to me at that moment. And so the job popped up and she was like, oh, I think you'll like it. It'll, give you the community contact that you're needing while you're writing the dissertation. So I get hired at the Royall House and Slave Quarters the day before everything shuts down in the pandemic. So then I was like, wow, shortest lived job I've ever had, because how does one run a museum that is closed? Yeah. Well, like every other institution, we pivoted to virtual programming, but shortly thereafter, there's the murder of George Floyd. And with that, I think really made me think about my position differently, partially because one of my board members sent me an email in a panic saying, people on Twitter are talking about burning down the slave quarters. I'm new on the job, and I'm like, you have Google Alerts on? I didn't even think to have Google Alerts on. And then I go and I'm reading all of the tweets, and I'm like, I get it. But what they're saying is there's a slave house in Medford, we should burn it down. Or when I was in 5th grade, I went there and it caused harm. And so they said that they were going to protest on site, and I said, okay, I'm going to just come and join them. So this is actually an image of what that protest looked like in Medford Square. When I got to the site, there were a few college students there, and I walk over to them and they're like, are we allowed to be here? And I'm like, of course. But then they're looking at me and I'm looking at them, and they're like, you work here? And I'm like, yes, I do. And they're like, well, tell me about this place. And I was like, oh, yeah, you didn't expect for me to be here. So then I tell them about the work that we're doing and the mission, and they decided, they have posters that said, F the Royals, burn it down, all of these good stuff. And I say, yeah, I agree with you, but like, please, no, not the museum, because it's an artifact, right? It's not a Confederate monument. It is one of the only places that we know that enslaved people lived, and they touched the walls and they walked the grounds, and we must preserve it. So they decided to go protest at the Royal Park next door, but it had me thinking about the way that we connect with communities. How do we connect with communities? And more importantly, if there are people in the town who are confused about our mission, if they think we are romanticizing the history of slavery, then we have a little bit of a problem. So a part of my work has been thinking about how to activate the site through material culture. And I'm going to talk briefly today about the 3 different ways. Let's see if I can get through everything. The 3 different ways that we're doing that. Through reinterpreting the objects on site, through new research, and then the last way is how we're creating artist-engaged programming with the community. So I am going to start with the John Singleton Copley portrait of Isaac's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. And I'm gonna, when people come on site, they often remark that, oh, it's so beautiful, and we've seen it at the MFA, and then I go, great, because it's not the MFA. I'm not gonna talk about the aesthetic value of this painting. I'm gonna do something a little differently. So I'm gonna read a little bit about how, if you come to the Royall House, what we talk about when we talk about this painting. Opulence. Luscious red and brown velvet curtains cascade from the ceiling to the floor. Adorned in rich blue and yellow silk dresses that seemingly shimmer in appearance, John Singleton Copley introduces us to Mary and Elizabeth Royall, heirs to one of the largest family fortunes in Massachusetts. In order to capture the seemingly unimaginable wealth of the Royals, Copley paints Mary holding a hummingbird while a King Charles Spaniel looks up at Elizabeth while laying on her lap. Although the girls present as polite, innocent, and extremely poised on the canvas, in real life, Mary and Elizabeth were enslavers in training. While the painting forces us to see the wealth of Mary and Elizabeth, their good fortune is the direct result of the deliberate misfortune of the hundreds of Black women, children, and men enslaved by the royal family in Massachusetts, in Rhode Island, in Antigua, in Jamaica, and in Suriname. In this portrait, we don't see enslaved people forced to toil in sugarcane fields in the Caribbean or do all of the domestic work on a 500-acre plantation in Medford. And yet, their invisible labor paid for everything, including Copley's commission and the expensive dresses on Mary and Elizabeth's backs. A hint of sweetness cuts through the opulence of Copley's portrait. With Mary's hand on her sister Elizabeth's shoulder, the painting depicts a loving and strong sisterly bond. Until Elizabeth's death in 1775, the two sisters would have supported each other through major life transitions such as marriage, childbirth, illness, in the beginning of the American Revolution. However, the self-assured stares of the sisters on the canvas give us a window into what Copley does not capture, the invisible pain of the enslaved people on the royal plantation. Compelled to labor without pay, enslaved women would have awakened the girls in the morning, bathed them, dressed them in their fancy silk dresses, styled their hair, and tended to any of their needs as they sat for their portrait. Thus, in 18th century Massachusetts, wealth and whiteness afforded the sisters protection not only from daily labor, but also from forced family separation. While Copley preserved the royal family on his canvas, enslaved women, men, and children were routinely sold away from their families without the promise or the possibility of seeing one another again. 2 years prior to Royall's commission of his daughter's portrait, he placed an ad in the Boston Evening Post in 1756, which I have alongside the portrait, which states, "Also to be sold, 2 Negro men used to farming and a likely Negro girl fit for town and country. For further particulars, inquire of Isaac Royall, Esquire, at Medford. Said Royall also wants to buy a right good saddle horse." The slave ad serves as a painful reminder that the royal family sold enslaved people with the same casualness in which they placed an inquiry for a new horse. So as we marvel at the beautiful portrait, we must remember that there is no sweetness in forced labor. So that's some of the work that's been happening on site. I always like to say that on one hand, I inherited a house museum. So the house is the house. The objects don't really change, but the stories do. And so a part of this work has been thinking through how to reinterpret the material culture that we have in the house alongside the records in the archive. And when you do that, you actually get to interrupt the way that interpretation happens in the space. You force people to think about not only what they see, but also what they don't see. So I wanted to show a few pictures, and I'll talk about this actually in in our conversation, of some of the textile work that we've been doing with local artist Stephen Hamilton, who's also a graduate student in the AAAS department at Harvard University. Essentially, he teaches BIPOC community members how to weave, how to sew, dyeing, using natural dyes, using the walnuts that actually grow on the royal plantation. And a part of this is also about, we call it reclaiming our hands, reclaiming our history, and thinking about the type of textile work that enslaved people would have done on that plantation and actually using it as a reclamation. If you were to take a weaving class, it would cost you thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. And so he was trained in Nigeria, and he does this now for free for community members. So this is another way that we're trying to interrupt the space of the plantation. Some more photos. This is just some photos of the community members in the site, and then also we've done this program in Roxbury at Madison Park High School. And then very quickly, I'm just going to end on Belinda Sutton because Belinda Sutton is the most famous enslaved person that we know from the Royall plantation. And what I want to leave us with is that a part of doing this work is thinking through what we know in the record about the enslaved people on the plantation. It's very easy to say, well, we know everything that we can know, but actually it's not true. A part of what has happened with Belinda is that she's become a symbol. She's become a symbol of success in the 18th century. She files what we would understand as a reparations petition in the 18th century. She wins, and then that's kind of where her story ends. You know, it's very triumphant, but it's actually not triumphant. She only gets 2 payments and then spends the rest of her life petitioning for the money because she needs it, but also struggling and living in poverty, right? And so it forces us to think about the ways in which Black people navigate slavery to freedom, and ultimately leads us with the question of, which I think, you know, scholars like the Volia Glimpf have actually told us that for Black people, freedom was never enough. It was actually just the beginning. And so I think I'm at time. So in our Q&A, I'll talk a little bit more about some of the new research that we've been working on.
So we have prepared some questions to discuss as we think about our projects together, and then of course we welcome your questions.
So our first question is, how do objects disrupt dominant narratives of Northern slavery?
And maybe you might want to speak to that because you ended with Belinda and her petition.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's very interesting is that when you have a petition that is as famous as Belinda's petition, you read that petition and you're really moved by it, and then you forget that there are several other petitions actually. So in some ways that petition kind of structures how we talk about her life. But when you read all of the petitions, you actually see that she is not only able to control a part of her narrative, but that she's actually telling us what life is like for black people in a revolutionary context. So one of the things that's fascinating and a part of what I've been exploring in my own work is the fact that in her third petition, she says that she is perishing for the necessities of life. She's struggling with hunger. We know that she's living in Boston. We know that the Royals are still helping her with her rent in some ways because she's not getting the money from the state, but it's clearly not enough. There are receipts in which they're paying for firewood, so that lets you know just the type of poverty that she is experiencing. And so for me, I have a really hard task, which is I don't want to take away from the amazingness of that petition, right? Because she's 70 years old, she files that petition, she stands up, she demands what she is owed. But then there's the flip side of that, which is what happens when those promises aren't fulfilled. And that's also a part of her journey. And I think one of the things that we have to do is disrupt that there's this idea that goes slavery to freedom. Racism doesn't just end when slavery starts to dissipate in the North. In fact, it becomes even more prevalent because, enslavers aren't trying to pay for labor. They just spent all these years not paying for labor. And so you see the power struggles that emerge.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. When I think about the dominant narratives of Northern slavery, I'm here thinking of the work of Gloria Whiting and Joanne Pope Mellish, who both talk about slavery as intimate, that maybe the Royal House is a bit of an exception when we think about the experiences of enslaved people, but they're often in very close proximity to their enslavers. And I think you talk about this too when you give tours of some of the enslaved people sleeping in the same bedroom as some of the royal family members, which is not how we often think about slavery, especially when we have that stereotype of the South.
They had two men on site that they distinguished between naming, they called them Peter and House Peter.
Right, yeah.
Which suggests that one of them was housed in the Great House.
That's
and
right.
one of them was elsewhere.
That's right. I don't know if you've had a chance to tour the Royal House, but it is incredible when you're in that space and you're thinking about enslaved people in that space and the enslavers in that space, and they're all in this room. I mean, it's a beautiful home, but just these people in, like, it sometimes it boggles the mind when we think about slavery and we think about the intimacy of it. The other point I would make about enslaved people, especially in the North and here in New England, is that they labored in households, in shops, in streets, in maritime spaces, and in churches. And so it's not the stereotype of the great plantation in the South, but it's actually in the church, tending to the wants and needs of the ministers.
When I started the excavations, this was quite some time ago now, started in 1999, and the only histories that I could find on Northern slavery at that time were very sanguine about how things were. Cotton Mather famously said something like, your servitude is gentle, and that was sort of the company line. Even among historians throughout the 20th century, I mean, even as recently as the 1980s and early 90s, they were writing about black Yankees, talking about the fact that Africans, this idea that they somehow had assimilated more completely and wholly into New England society. And because I suspected that this was wrong, but I didn't have any proof, so like that really helped me focus what I was looking for when we started excavating at the Royal House, because like, all right, well, what would that look like? If this was more family-like, what would we expect to find? And then let's see what we find and compare them. And that's how we sort of got in there. But we quickly discovered that basically every myth that we had about the institution up here was wrong, and badly so. And something that Kabria was talking about, the material aspects of freedom, was very interesting to me, because I was like, aha, Isaac Royall manumitted a few enslaved people too, and he didn't give them anything. And one of the, it didn't strike me quite as hard until I heard you say it, the physical aspects of what freedom really means. Because one of the men that he manumitted from his exile in Nova Scotia and then the UK, or London, was a man named George, who, if records seem to indicate that George had been with them since childhood, was probably a young playmate of Isaac Jr., or something like that. And when he was manumitted, he slit his own throat. And the Royals, because he was an old elderly man and facing freedom, legal freedom, but not real freedom, and in fact couldn't face, didn't want to face what would be required to be a free man at that point. And then to add insult to injury, they sold all his belongings and used that to pay for his burial, after 50 years of service. Come on. And so that's what I always ask my students, like, what does that mean to say, like, they're always talking about kind masters in New England. What does that mean? What are you trying to say with that? Isaac Royall is commemorated on his tombstone as a good friend and a kind master. So we were wondering, like, was that just a performance, or was he just truly delusional? We're not quite sure, but anyway. But yes, objects I think of artifacts or objects as sort of like, there's the official narrative or the myths that get handed down, and then the objects that come out of the ground are like the leaks to the press. They tell the real story that the official narrative was trying to keep hidden. Should we move on?
Sure. We have one more question. We have a few more questions, but maybe after this question we'll pause and open it up to all of you.
Where do we see agency among the enslaved in these objects? Where do we see evidence for identity, survival, and personhood from evidence that is fragmentary?
Maybe I'll start, or do you want to start?
I think one of us, you go.
I will just say very briefly about Flora. As I said, we had those 4 questions initially that we asked about her life and hoping that the archive would tell us something. And I think in some ways the archive has, but not as exactly answers to those questions. So we don't have her full list. In fact, in the archive, we only have one document with Flora's mark, which is an X. And that is her acknowledging receipt of the objects and the money from the will. I still am stuck with this phrase in McGilchrist's will that says, all her wearing apparel. I think that is sort of a way we might glimpse a little bit of her personhood, of her identity, that she has clothes, and that she might want those clothes after she is manumitted, and she might want to wear those clothes after as a free woman. So that's the most visible she kind of becomes in the will. I will say she is able to get married, so she marries a man named John Nichols, and we haven't been able to determine if John Nichols was also enslaved. We don't know if John Nichols was enslaved at the church, but we know there was another enslaved boy at the church, which makes us wonder, were Flora and John, were they both young enslaved children at the church and grew up together and then they got married? We don't know. But those are the things that we have to imagine sometime in the record. But it seems that at least upon her manumission and emancipation, she was able to live a free life. And I think some of the difficulties that enslaved people face with precarity, it doesn't appear that that is something Flora experienced. And it's probably in part because of the money that McGilchrist left her and also these objects.
I found a lot of, we found a lot of evidence of agency and self-definition at the Royal House, particularly in the small objects of daily life. Tobacco pipes, that's very intimate, right? That's very individual. Gaming pieces, evidence of leisure time, which is something, this is time that they are actively reclaiming from their time that supposedly belongs to Isaac Royall. Evidence of maintaining a non-European aesthetic, which goes against the Black Yankees myth with the stone bead. And there's also evidence we found, what we believe, of magic and conjuration on the site. Certainly these private acts of spirituality and possibly, conjuration and such are evidence of people who were trying to harness supernatural powers or to get protection from the ancestors and such. That opens up a whole new line of questioning, like why do they need protection from the ancestors if Isaac Royall is a kind master, if northern slavery isn't so bad? What was the use of conjuration in that scenario? We also found evidence of medical self-help, because the Royals spared no expense on medical help for their enslaved people, but doctoring in the 18th century was more likely to, they were going to doctor you to further illness or death with their heroic treatments of purging, puking, blistering, cutting, and all of that. And it totally ignores the fact that for many African cultures, there is a spiritual component to illness that is being completely ignored in those kind of treatments. But they spent on Christmas Eve, I think it was, or thereabouts, a ton of money to have a boy force-fed mercury. Obviously, they thought they were doing the right thing, but enslaved people knew better. Like, they know what they have to face the consequences. So better to try to deal with your own ailments as best you can through ointments and perhaps through rituals and that kind of thing. Yeah, so.
I was going to say, one of the things that the record won't always tell us are the ways in which, even when we're talking about medical treatments, like enslaved people would have had their own rituals that they would have used, not only for themselves, but also for the royals and other people. But those aren't often documented, which I always find very fascinating. But we know that that's happening. I think the other place, in speaking about religion, in thinking through Belinda and her petition, one of the things that's very interesting is that she talks about her homeland, and she talks about the Rio de Volta region, which we understand as modern-day Ghana, and she talks about Orishas, right? So we know that she has maintained a connection to her own spiritual practices. And my colleague, Abid Alabai, has written really eloquently about these petitions. But I think it's so important, actually, because it's right there in the record, actually. It's right there. And, and when it's there in the record, you actually cannot ignore it. But a part of what has happened is that people don't take African spirituality seriously. So then what you see in some of the people who have written about it is that they actually focus on the way that she evokes Christianity to condemn the royals and to condemn the loyalists fighting during the revolution, and to talk about why she deserves to be free. But actually at the beginning of the petition, she talks about her homeland. She talks about her parents. She talks about her spiritual practices. And I think when we think about agency, what is more, I think, what is a better example than resisting one's autonomy being stripped and remembering that you have a past, which is what slavery tries to take away from Black people, right? It tries to erase their past.
Do we want to open it to some wider questions?
Thank you, and thank you all for your talks and comments. I wanted to ask a follow-up question to that, which is something that fascinates me in Salem when we think about like the African Society, which is not the African American Society, it's African Society, and just wondering if in your work you have thoughts on like how we might think about spaces of enslaved people, including slave quarters, but also like where they worked as like international spaces, and like what that looks like in the material and documentary record.
Well, I don't know how to. I'm curious to hear what these two have to say about that. One of the threads of my research at the Royal House was the racialization of American society in the 18th century, which would indicate like taking all of these international people and like flattening them, right? To like a pan-African, like you've got a bunch of different Africans and now they're just Black. And that's something that didn't really exist prior to the 18th century. 18th century is like capitalism took over the world, and like the ideas of race, like that we recognize as our modern ideas of race, are thought to have roots in the 18th century. And so I was curious about, can we start to see the beginnings of, quote, what we as modern people would recognize as white and Black? And my argument was that yes, we were beginning to see that in the archaeology through the separation and the use of space and all of that. But I'm curious about the more international aspect.
I would say I probably haven't considered it as international spaces as much as diasporic spaces. When I'm teaching about early African American history, and particularly about the slave trade, I make it a point not to begin in British North America. We cannot begin the story of Black history in British North America. So I go back to West Africa. I'm not a historian of West Africa at all, but I've read enough to be able to teach a couple of sessions on early West Africa. And I think about the diaspora in those terms. especially around Black Election Day celebrations, which occurred in New England, but also in the South and the Caribbean. And they originate from what is present-day Ghana, Ashanti celebrations. So there were the King Pompey work that we did that was with Megan Howie at UNH. Also, I'm not an archaeologist. I have so much respect and love for archaeology. It was great to tag along with her on this project. We were trying to understand King Pompey as a leader of these Black Election Day celebrations in Lynn, in Saugus. We don't know a lot about him either, but I imagine that he was African born, and he was said to be really well respected precisely because he was African born. So it's more of a diasporic connection that I see. I think you have seen those connections too, right? Looking at Antigua and the royal family, and then West Africa.
Yeah, I was gonna say, one of the things that I feel the most like a historian when I go back into like newspaper archives, because actually it tells you so much about how people are identifying. So one of the things that we see is that Black people are identifying as African like into the 19th century, actually. The other thing that we know is that they are very attuned to the diaspora. In fact, you see all of these celebrations, West Indian Emancipation Day, you see that they're celebrating Haiti and they're organizing around Haiti in Boston, which is amazing, right? And so it's really, I think, important, and a part of this, I think, has to do with how many, it's like we have to think about the mobility of Black people in the period. I think we often think that enslaved or free Black people are not mobile, but it's actually not true. Especially Black men who were sailors actually kind of usher in a type of cosmopolitanism. But you see that information circulates. And so when you see that they're identifying as African and organizing as African and then celebrating Black freedom movements across the diaspora, I think it's always important to remember that Black people in the past also saw themselves as a part of a diasporic community, but also a community that was rooted in the liberation of all Black people, regardless of where you were.
I was wondering if the things that Flora received in the will was typical. I mean, it seemed like it was a lot of stuff, including money in the red purse and things like that. Was that typical at all, or did most emancipated folks get less?
It's interesting because I was looking at Flora's will. I thought this would be a great dissertation project for someone to look at the wills of enslavers and see the ways in which enslaved people are mentioned. So in the example of Isaac Royall, he freed a couple of enslaved people, but he didn't give them anything. In some of the research that I've done in Andover, in North Andover, enslaved people were sometimes given money, but not the list of objects. So it's one of those things where I don't have data that I can give you and to give you a kind of firm answer. But I would say just in my experience of maybe looking at, 100 wills of enslavers at this point, McGilchrist was the most comprehensive in the objects that he had given to Flora.
Was she a favorite of his? Is that possibly why he gave her all these things?
It could be. We have so little information, so we can't assume that. I will say that it seems that she was the only person he enslaved. So there was an assistant minister by the name of Robert Nichols, who later becomes actually an abolitionist, and he endorses Agriano's narrative, and he moves back to the UK. But he enslaved a boy, and that's who I believe was John. So there were probably only 2 enslaved people directly at the church. But I think, especially in preparing for this panel, we've been talking about the ways in which enslaved people are still all about the town, right, in various capacities. So at St. Peter's, we know enslaved people are building the church. We have receipts from the collection about that. So we could just imagine the ways in which enslaved people are part of the building of Salem and Salem's institution.
There's good documentary evidence that there was favoritism at the Royal estate as well, because there are certain individuals who are continuously singled out for extra rations, extra food, like extra clothing, greater freedom of movement and like trust. And then also favoritism in work and family matters, because they kept some families together and they split other ones apart. And that depended on their relationship with Isaac Royall, you know. So it seems pretty capricious from our perspective, but it probably was rooted in a sense of favoritism.
And that could also be a way in which we register a little bit of enslaved people's agency, because they would maybe sometimes try to strategize and manipulate those relations, right? So that their families wouldn't be sold away. So we see that too.
Yeah. I think it's always really important to remember that enslaved people, they are so aware of all of the dynamics all the time. And they are constantly trying to not only secure their freedom or secure, you know, more freedom, but they're often really trying to protect themselves and their family. And while this is not connected to the Royals, but you have the case Mark, Phyllis, and Phoebe, they poison their enslaver in Charlestown, and all of that is about Mark trying to be reunited and live with his family. You know, he's asking nicely, he's like offering to hire himself out and give them money. He's like trying every single thing in order to be reunited with his family, and he can't. And so then eventually, you know, he tries poison, and it works, you know. But then there's also the fact, and Gloria Whiting writes about this as well, that one of the enslaved women was also probably being abused by the enslaver. And so there's also that protection of the people as well, the kinship ties that they form, right? Even though they're not related, you know, they're still protecting one another.
Flora's clay pipe is very evocative, but in your investigations, did you find other evidence? I think particularly of the kitchen. Was there a separate kitchen that you could identify? And are there African foods being continued there? And even could you distinguish the enslaved from one part of Africa from another part of Africa?
Well, I'll start with the last question first, which is most of the enslaved people had come through Antigua. They were first in Antigua, and so we don't know. Based on their names, we can assume that they were mostly of Akan heritage, because a lot of them had Akan day names. And that's another way that, by the way, that the Royals were perhaps a little, or flattered themselves that they were a little different, because they allowed enslaved people to name themselves, you know, keep their names and name their children and stuff. As far as foodways go, though, it's very interesting, because I really expected a very different pattern in terms of foodways going in. I said to myself, well, I mean, if it was more free up here and they had more freedom of movement, blah, 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 this is what I would expect to see. Lots of wild game, plenty of evidence of like kitchen gardens and all of this. And what did we find? Zip, zero, zilch, nada, nothing. And why that's interesting is because paradoxically, on these plantations in the South and the Caribbean, that's become quite expected, is that you find lots of wild game and evidence of kitchen gardens, and you know, supplementing their own rations and clear agency. And we don't see it at all at the Royal House. All of the stuff is like basic farm, New England farm fare. Even the fish bones, I was excited at first because I thought maybe they're going fishing. But they're deep water fish, so we know they came from market. I was hoping to find evidence of stews and pottages, like, that would be showing up in terms of like cow or animal bones that have been chopped and just thrown in a pot. But we've got just clean, kind of English meat and potatoes on the plate. And so the question was, how do we interpret this? On the one hand, maybe they have enough rations and they don't need to supplement. On the other, Medford was so, there was a certain invisibility in a part of the South that might be 85 or 90% black. You could go about your business in a way that perhaps when there's only 10 of you, you don't really have freedom of movement. You're easily spotted out and about. There was a curfew in Medford at 9 p.m., although I did go through all the Century's town meeting minutes, and there was never, it was on pain of whipping in the public square. I didn't find any evidence that it ever happened, but there were rules in place, and so I started thinking that maybe there was less freedom of movement up here. There was the proximity of the people being in the Great House, and then the slave quarters just a stone's throw away, might have made it so it wasn't really possible to go, harvest things in the wild and be free in that way. And that what did that mean for life here, especially if they were coming from a place where they were able to do that, perhaps in the Caribbean. Also take into consideration that they are new to New England. Also, they don't know what the heck's going on up here. They've never experienced a winter, New England winter. They don't know the wildlife or the environment. So there's definitely would have been a transitional phase there. I've been waiting for 20 plus years for more archaeology at other sites to see how that pattern compares to another site of the same period. Is this something that is characteristic of Northern slavery, or is this just idiosyncratic to this site? It would be really nice to know, but I don't know.
Another question. Have any of you seen the Marblehead slave quarters that have just opened? I have not, but any comment on that comparison?
My comment would be biased because I was one of the advisors on the project, so I think it's fantastic, and I would encourage everyone to visit and really look at it. Have you had a chance, Lynn? No.
It's that the openings to
That's right. That's right.
Three things there.
Yeah, that's right.
I think I also was an advisor on the project. I think it's a great it's a great institution. It's a great museum, and it's also a reminder that there's still more that we are uncovering every single day, right? And so the more slave quarters that we have, right, the more that we're able to talk about the complexity and the complete nature of what the landscape look like, especially thinking about where places are located right by the water. It opens up all types of really interesting conversations, and so I haven't been there to see it yet, but I'm looking forward to it.
Do you want to?
Thank you so much for your research. This was really wonderful. So much to think about. And I think in the course of an hour, you taught us the real value of the material objects, the artifacts, for really correcting these untruthful, romanticized histories of the past. So thank you for all you're doing. I'm going to do the thing where I'm going to actually ask two questions, if that's okay. Because the first, I would love to hear about the community work that you're doing. And I think, Alexandra, I was really struck by the sight lines kind of from from your research, and I'm wondering how you break down the sightlines in the present to bring communities into these spaces and really be able to connect over this history kind of through interpretation, through the materials, through the archive. So I'd just love to know how you're fostering these conversations. And then I think some of the comments on waterways, knowing about King Pompey's house on the river. I'm just curious if you could speak a little, and the Royal House just being right on the Mystic River like that. Does your research teach us anything about rivers or waterways? So those are my two questions slipped into one.
I guess I'm still technically on the advisory council for the museum, but I haven't been tapped for any advising for quite some time. But when they were first transitioning from a standard house museum, dedicated to our great white forefathers, over to something that was more inclusive, one of the biggest first changes they did was they stopped doing the tour. This was based on the research and the sight lines that you're talking about. They stopped starting the tour at the front door and started at the kitchen. And also moved through the house in a way where you could only see what the servants got to see. So you had to take the servants' stair up, and maybe you couldn't go see the room you wanted to see, or whatever. I thought that was very interesting. And there's lots of research in archaeology about processional ways. I mean, you can even, talking about Stonehenge and all of the monuments and the monolithic sites of Europe. There was a processional aspect to the landscape, and that was absolutely true at the Royal House, I argue, as well, because you had the elms and then there was the long drive, and you come into a big, expertly laid cobbled courtyard, and you see what they want you to see when they want you to see it, and the people who were indebted to Isaac Royall didn't come in the formal drive. They came in the side door in his little office where he collected, the money from his tenants and such. And so they had a different way of moving through the landscape, as did enslaved people. And so what was built to impress the Royals' peers and the class that they were aspiring to be a part of, simultaneously probably would have restricted and oppressed people who were enslaved and imprisoned by that same landscape, because they processed through it differently. They experienced it differently, and it changes the meaning of the landscape depending on who you are. So that's what I try to, whenever I'm talking about it, and when we were first discussing how we could shake things up at the Royal House, that was one of the things we talked about.
Maybe you want to...
Yeah, so I would say that over the last 6 years, a lot has been about kind of even rethinking whatever dominant narratives that a plantation can create by existing. So one of the things is that it is a plantation. So calling it a plantation. And by doing so, it is a reminder that the way that we talk about slavery also matters, and that the way that people experience the space also kind of matters, because when you get there and you're like, it's a plantation, but it's not what you think of, because you think of Southern plantations, right? And so because you think of Southern plantations, then you're a little, thrown off, because what usually happens is people go, well, what did they grow here? And I usually smile, because I'm kind of like, well, it's a different climate, right? Slavery is experienced differently based on time and location. It's just different. And so what does a northern plantation look like? Well, here's what this looks like. So that's one of the ways I think that's been really important. But I think the next thing has been about not keeping it in the past, because one of the things that can happen is that when you come and you're experiencing it as an 18th century site and it tells an 18th century story, you can then trap Black people in the 18th century. And so what's really important to me is that when people come, they're thinking also about the afterlives of slavery and how that impacts communities today, right? And so it's not enough to come through the site and go, slavery was really bad. I'm so happy I know about it, and I'm so happy it doesn't exist any longer. Actually, that makes me feel like I failed as a director, right? It's more of like, slavery was really terrible in how does it impact Black communities today? And then making those ties. So what does it mean that it's not too far away from West Medford, which was a historical Black community that is not there really anymore, you know? Most people no longer have their homes. Some people do, but it's not what it was. What does it mean to tie enslaved people to a Black freedom movement that's happening in Boston? And we know that they're connected, right? We know that some of the members are connected to the Prince Hall Masonic Law Lodge. We know that they are living with one another in Boston. There are all of these different ways. And so also not making the plantation and Medford disconnected from Black people in Boston as a way to kind of help think through those connections. And I think the last way of like how site works is, what does it mean to come onto a plantation today and rethink the story that we tell, right? Because a part of what has happened is that the stories that we tell also means that these individuals are frozen in time, and that actually the research keeps changing because there's more documents available. So constantly making, living history, updating the analysis. And so I think that those are the things that we've been also grappling with as well.
I don't know if you wanted to highlight the workshop that you lead, but one of the things I really have been getting into, and you know this too, Christy, is making and crafting, which is not something I would naturally gravitate toward, I would say. As a historian, I stick to my archival documents, collections, but I've been really interested in process, whether it's printing, which has been fascinating, we've talked about that, or in Kyera's case, there's a workshop with the textiles, and just thinking about how enslaved people would have dyed garments, and actually trying to do it and realizing how bad I am at it, right, and very slow and having to start over. It gives you a different sense of enslaved people and their labor. And it felt interesting, and I went with my kids and we talked about it after, and they appreciated too, thinking about enslaved people coming to or being forced to come to British North America, but with knowledge, with cultures, with languages, with traditions. And they love the scarves they made, right? It's sort of a highlight, and just thinking about craft and the joy that might come in those fleeting moments as they're dealing with and managing slavery. But I don't know if you want to say more about that.
I mean, that is the best, compliment for some of the programming that's happening. But a part of it is like, what does it mean for a plantation to be a joyful space? Can it be a joyful space? And, that might feel complicated for people. But for me, I'm a historian of slavery, of course. Like, I want to talk about slavery all the time. A 13-year-old might not want to, and that's actually okay. So what can we do to get them on site and then teach these histories in really interesting ways? And so a part of what happens at the do-rag and silk scarf workshop is that you start with a lecture, and Stephen is lecturing about the politics of Black adornment and the policing that happens with head wraps for Black people in the 18th and the 19th century and all the way up to today. And so kind of you get that history, and then you also get to understand how significant these items are to culture. You see people wearing them on the runway. But there's a history to that. And so I think what we've been trying to do as well is to think through the process of making. What does it mean to make, but also what does it mean to create a community of community members who can gather and learn something together, and how does that then change the way that you experience the space? It interrupts it in some ways, right? When we have those workshops and it's on the weekends, that means people can't come into the slave quarters, because that time is reserved. And we try to make sure they don't overlap, but sometimes they do. And And for me, then that feels a little hard because people are like, oh, I'm coming to see the space. And, you know, it's also like, yeah, you can see the space, but right now for 2 hours, I'm so sorry, you can't. And being able to claim that time for community members, I think is really important. But I'm really happy you enjoyed it. Yeah. And the work of Alexandra means that we have all of this archaeology that lets us know exactly what people were doing on the plantation.
That's right.
You know, they're sewing needles, they're all of these things. So we know what they were doing, and to be able to teach those.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.